So welcome, everyone. I'm Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. I'm delighted that you could be with us today. This program is being recorded and will be posted on the Arlington County 55 Plus YouTube channel as time permits. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that only he appears in the recording. I hope you all had a meaningful Juneteenth. Since we were closed yesterday for the holiday, we are commemorating Juneteenth today with a very special program about civil rights activist Barbara Johns. And I'm honored and delighted to introduce our guest speaker for today, Cainan Townsend. Cainan is the managing director of the Robert Russa Moton Museum, a National Historic Landmark in Farmville, Virginia, which, as you'll learn, is in Prince Edward County, Virginia. As you probably know, Prince Edward County was the last place in the country to integrate its public schools, for years engaging in a policy referred to as massive resistance and closing its public schools rather than follow the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision mandating desegregation. Cainan leads the Moton Museum education team as they work to advance the museum's mission in all parts of the Commonwealth through active education and public program offerings. A Prince Edward County native, Cainan attended public school there. He graduated from Longwood University, also in Farmville, with a Bachelor of Science in Liberal Studies and a minor in leadership studies. He received his Master of Science in Counselor Education, also from Longwood. Cainan is the great-grandson of John Townsend, a plaintiff from the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court case, and his father is a member of the lost generation that missed several years of education by the closing of the Prince Edward County Public Schools from 1959 to 1964. Cainan has served in several prominent educational positions. In 2016, he was a governor's fellow with the Virginia Secretary of Education in Governor Terry McAuliffe's administration. In November 2017, he was elected to serve on the Prince Edward County School Board. In January 2018, he was appointed to serve on the African American Cultural Resources Task Force by Governor McAuliffe. In August 2019, he was appointed to the Commission for African American History Education by Governor Ralph Northam. And today he's going to share with us the story of Barbara Johns, a young student activist in high school who led the 1951 Moton School Strike that was a catalyst for the long struggle for desegregation of public schools in Virginia and in the nation. Going to ask for people to please hold your questions until the end. We will be allowing time for questions. If you would like, please feel free to enter your questions in the chat as we go. But again, there will be time at the end when Mr. Townsend will answer your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the program over to Cainan Townsend.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Sheila. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for the invitation and taking your time out of your day to come and watch and chat with me today. I always have trouble listening to the bio that's read. I feel like I'm a lot less cool than what that is, but certainly either way, I am glad to be here with you all this afternoon. Story that we're going to be sharing here for a bit is an important one, but some background before we kind of get started here, as I will get myself adjusted on this end. Can everybody see that fine? Or Sheila, you're the only one I can see, but if you give me a thumb up.
Is
okay.
Perfect.
Perfect. So Moton School Story, Children of Courage is kind of the main title for this presentation. And as was mentioned, you're welcome to type questions in the chat and I will get to every question as I can as soon as I get to that point in the presentation. But I felt the need to one, describe what on earth yesterday even was. So Juneteenth, which is now a federal holiday, has been celebrated by folks for much longer than it's been a federal holiday. Juneteenth, of course, represents Juneteenth June 19th, 1865, where the last enslaved people located in Galveston, Texas, were essentially made aware of their freedom. And so we kind of mark that and commemorate that date as the kind of official kind of end of slavery, at least in that capacity. Of course, eventually with the forthcoming 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and such to go after that. Okay, so that's Juneteenth. It's a time to, as the holiday itself is kind of something that was lesser known, it kind of becomes this holiday to celebrate and to acknowledge and to commemorate history of African American or of the African diaspora that is also lesser known or tended to be hidden history. None of this stuff is hidden to the people in these communities, but hidden to the broader kind of world. The second thing I feel the need to kind of explain is, what is a Prince Edward County, right? Because a lot of you were like, Prince Edward, Farmville. Some of you said Farmville, the video game, right? Which is, a little older at this point, but still we get it all the time. So Farmville, Prince Edward County. Prince Edward County, founded in 1754, was kind of broken off from the neighboring Amelia County to kind of branch off and make its own county. And on the right, you see kind of a map of Virginia. In red, there is Prince Edward. Prince Edward County gets called the heart of Virginia. We're about an hour west of Richmond, roughly, in terms of geography. So from you all, probably about 3 hours or so in terms of a drive, but we're an hour from Lynchburg, an hour from Richmond, about an hour from Charlottesville. So kind of taking that point of being called the heart of Virginia. And if you go back to our seal that's on our county flag today, what you'll see is kind of things that represent different aspects of the county. And right here in the middle, and this was done only last year, this is Moton in the middle of the county seal for Prince Edward now. It used to be the old county seat of Prince Edward, which was Worsham, but that was no longer the county seat of Prince Edward, but that was still in the flag. And so they changed it up with Moton. Now, lastly, before I kind of get started, a couple of things to like, okay, I understand where it is, but I still don't understand why we're talking about it. One, because it kind of falls into that category of some lesser known history, at least to broader populations of people. People don't tend to know all the kind of fine details about Brown versus Board of Education. Most people have never even heard of a person like Barbara Johns. And so certainly it's important for that. But a couple of other notes and tidbits that just makes Prince Edward a bit different. In 1811, and I'm not going to spend a tremendous amount of time talking about this because this could be a rabbit hole, but if y'all do think of questions for this, certainly you're welcome to have those and I can answer those towards the end. But the Israel Hill community is a community that was started in Prince Edward County around 1811. This is a free African-American community, at least dating 50 plus years prior to the Civil War even being fought. And this wasn't just a free Black community, this was a very prominent free Black community. A historian by the name of Melvin Patrick Ely, who is a professor at the College of William and Mary, wrote a book, Israel Hill Mathematics. I certainly would encourage anybody here to read it if you're curious. But essentially, there is this thriving group of free Black African-American people in Prince Edward County. They've got jobs, they've got land. So the big thing about why they were so successful is that Richard Randolph Jr., who owned kind of the Bazaar plantation here in Prince Edward County, when he died, he arranged so that the heads of household from all of his enslaved people were deeded 25 to 50 acres of land each. So each of these Israelites had this gigantic kind of portions of land. They could build generational wealth, they could build entrepreneurship, right? Which gave them a lot of things in common with the working white people in that community at that point in time. So going way back to the late 1700s, we had African-American and white people working together, right? We had people establishing business relationships and entrepreneurship together. Our First Baptist Church here in Prince Edward County was co-founded by Black and white people. This would have been the early 1800s, right? Things that you probably wouldn't imagine happening in a place in the South during that time, but did happen. Right. So we had that free community of African-American people, and that's not even all the free Black people. So there were already about 300 free Black people before Israel Hill even came into existence. So then you fast forward a little bit to the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion, right? You know what happens after the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion. There's a crackdown on educating Black people and enslaved persons, even though that was already illegal. And also, Black people were already not allowed to be armed, but certainly Black people and weapons was not a thing that people in the South were going to really deal with after the Nat Turner Slave Rebellion. The Israel Hill community being no exception, even though they were a free community, they had weapons at the time, which was already unusual. But the community here then kind of confiscate those weapons and then sell the profits of those weapons back to the Israel Hill community. Why am I talking about this? Because it just speaks to the very weird and unique nature that happened in Prince Edward County and the relationship between Black and white people during that time. Yeah, the third thing I'll mention, and then I promise we'll get onto the main show here shortly, but is a direct connection to the Civil War. So Farmville often becomes the place where the Civil War ends and the Civil Rights Movement begins, because April 6th and 7th, you have the Battle of High Bridge, which was fought directly leading into as the Confederates were retreating towards Appomattox. And then, of course, April 8th was the Battle of Appomattox and end of the Civil War. So certainly Farmville has a key role kind of in that conversation. And then less than 100 years later, you've got Barbara Johns and her fellow students kind of standing up on the stage of Moton High School and starting a protest. And so certainly that will be eventually leading to Brown versus Board of Education. So that juxtaposition is not something that's lost upon us, and it's something I'll talk a little bit more about here shortly. 1866, the year after the Civil War ends, you have schools in Prince Edward County. You've got about 4 free Black schools with 150 students. Okay, and in 1866, I can't demonstrate how much earlier that is than most other communities. Most Black communities, or most communities in general in the South, were not going to allow a Black schoolhouse, let alone multiple Black schoolhouses, to be put up, even probably in 1866. I mean, really kind of you get towards Reconstruction, a little bit farther in Reconstruction era, where you start to see schools become more organized more regularly. But the fact that in 1866, there were already 150 students in 4 schools in Prince Edward County is a really strong indication on Prince Edward County's feelings towards education. And then the last thing that I'll mention is a study that was done by a gentleman whose name I'm sure you all know, W.B. Du Bois. He did the study on the Farmville Negro in Prince Edward County in 1898. And actually significant portions of the 1898 study that he does in Prince Edward County, talking about the peculiar hopefulness of the Farmville Negroes, right? A big portions of that are used in his Philadelphia study, which he is a lot more kind of well-known because, from. So a lot of the seeds kind of his Philadelphia study, the famous one, kind of comes from and has some direct quotes from the Prince Edward County study that was done in 1898. So there are a couple of kind of contextual points as to why this is important. And then even with some of those kind of free Black people back in the day, they had experiences with entrepreneurship with white people, Black and white people had kind of some examples of coexisting. And then the last thing I mentioned is that there was court experience. And so these African-American people, these Israelites, these free Black people, of course, during that time period, they would not have been allowed to testify in any kind of criminal trials, but civil trials they could. So often, if I was an Israelite and I was doing work with a white person, let's say you didn't pay me or you didn't pay me on time, I would take you to court in civil trial. And in the early 1800s, one would assume the African-American was going to lose, but in many cases they won. So what that kind of established was a precedent. The precedent that if somebody does something by me wrong, if I haven't been given justice, there's an avenue to seek justice. And often in this community, that avenue ends up being the court system, which we will definitely be talking about here today. So as I speed up a little bit through to kind of get us started with kind of the more contemporary parts of the story, we've got Farmville. Looking right in Farmville, this is Main Street in Farmville. So if you come to town today, you'd see exactly this, except we do have more than one stoplight in that area there today. But you can kind of see the restaurants and the shops, and Farmville was a different place then. Believe it or not, Farmville kind of was the spot to be in. We drew a lot of kind of tourism because this picture was taken before the modern interstate system was completed. So back then you could travel Route 15 and get from just about from New York to Florida. And so going Route 15, that led you right through Farmville, Virginia. So that's why we had a lot of hotels, lots of restaurants, lots of kind of recreation opportunities. But the thing was that with actions have consequences, and unfortunately, those consequences came after the schools kind of closed down, and to see kind of the economic downturn in fortune for Farmville. But we'll talk more about that as we continue forward. But I always like starting with this picture to kind of show. All right, so this picture, Moton High School. And so the reason we're talking about this history is a lot of reasons. There's some direct connections to Juneteenth also, but it's also kind of the spreading of that lesser known history. This building, which is where I'm standing in right now, this was formerly Robert Russo Moton High School. Robert Russo Moton High School was the first freestanding African-American high school built in Prince Edward County. Now, who was Robert Russo Moton? Very quickly, Robert Russo Moton, he was an African-American educator, very prominent. He was born, and depending on who you ask, in Amelia or in Prince Edward County. He was raised in Prince Edward County. He went off to be the second principal of Tuskegee. So he succeeded Booker T. Washington at Tuskegee. He's a lot more known at Hampton, today Hampton University, back then Hampton Normal Institute. He's big into kind of African-American trades and such. He advised something like 5 U.S. presidents. He was the only African-American speaker at the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial. So that's an indication of how highly he was thought of for the time. And so then when they were naming this building, they wanted it to be named after a prominent Prince Edwardian, and that's why they chose Dr. Moton. And so Moton High School opens up 1939. This building was built to hold about 180 students. And at peak occupancy, this building has about 477 students total in the building at one point. And so now we wonder, where on earth did all the kids fit? And for point of reference, I am standing like somewhere like back here. If y'all, I think y'all can see my mouse. So I'm somewhere back there. Where do they have class if they didn't have the space? Well, they had to be creative with their space to make sure they could even execute having a school. So you see a picture outside of their school. Sometimes they'd have classes kind of in the grassy area in between the two parts of the building, you know, depending on the weather. Sometimes they'd have it kind of on the sidewalks and such. Sometimes they'd have to take class over to their athletic field because, again, they just didn't have space inside the building. Built for less than 200, had almost 500. So you could have classes on your school buses, even too, again, if they didn't have the space for it. And in the auditorium, they could have 3 classes happening at the same time. So you can see up front, towards over the left, you see the baby grand piano, right? So imagine you could be taking a music lesson on one side of the classroom, and then on the other side of the auditorium. Other side of the auditorium, you could be learning math or science. And then in the back, because Moton didn't have a gym, there's a basketball rim mounted on that wall, on the back wall of Moton High School. So music lesson here, maybe a math or science lesson here, and then you could have at the same time a full-on scrimmage happening all at the same time, right? How do you study in a classroom where you can't do something as simple as have a easygoing volume, right? If you can't focus and concentrate because somebody's dribbling a basketball behind you, right? Very, very difficult. But it's the situation that these students had to deal with. This is the era of separate but equal, the era that I'm sure you all are at least somewhat aware of. Separate very much was apparent. The equal, in most cases, was nowhere really to be found. Less than a mile away from where I'm currently standing used to stand the all-white Farmville High School. Farmville High School was one of 2 segregated white schools in this community. You had Farmville High School here, and you also had Worsham High School, which was a little bit more farther out into the county. There were actually more high school-aged African-American students in Prince Edward County at that point in time than were white high school-aged students in Prince Edward County at that point in time. So no matter how you compared it, the separate, again, was there, and the equal was not so clearly there. Go inside, whoops, went the wrong arrow. Going outside Farmville High School towards the back, you see their football field. Farmville High School football field had lights. The one at Moton did not have lights. So if Moton football team was playing away at a team that had lights, they would have to request permission of the white football coaches to go practice on the Farmville football high school field. So that way they could have some experience playing under lights and wouldn't go to these away games to be completely disoriented, having played under lights for the first time in those away games. Inside the school, of course, Farmville High School did have a dedicated gymnasium. They had lockers, they had an auditorium with permanent seating in it, dedicated teacher workspace, dedicated teacher restrooms. Again, things that were standard in most high schools, but they just did not have at Moton High School. Here is a picture of Worsham High School, which was the one that was further out in the county. Now, Worsham, not nearly as big as Farmville High School. It's probably like 1.5 times the size, or 0.75 times the size of Farmville High School, but it was still much larger than Moton. And still had much less students to attend that school. So again, no matter how you really compared these two things, separate was very, very apparent, and equal was not quite apparent. In 1948, to deal with that overcrowding, the county puts up 3 buildings that were adjacent to the space. And these buildings become known as tar paper shacks. And these tar paper shacks were exactly what they sound like, tar paper and covering a shack. And so there's a wooden structure, kind of windows, put some doors on the other side, you put a roof on it, and you put this tar paper. And if you've ever shingled a roof, you've probably used tar paper. But back then, that was the only thing protecting these spaces from the outside weather. Hot, cold, rain, shine. And so the kids called these the adult-sized chicken coops, because that's essentially what they were. They were using the same building materials used to build chicken houses. And so in many ways, I kind of believe this is the county's way of sending a message to these students. Know your place, stay in your lane. We'll value your education about the same level as we value our livestock, right? So know your place, stay in your lane, which really, really infuriated these students. There's a picture a little bit closer up so you can kind of see really some of the texture of that building and how not ideal of a building that was. Inside the buildings, they put in potbelly stoves, which were these kind of large, I've heard some wood or coal burning, but primarily wood burning stoves. And that's why you got the chimneys and such that are on the top. The big thing about the potbelly stoves, if you're sitting too close to it, you could feel it too much. If you sat 2 seats away, you couldn't feel it at all. So it was really truly a Band-Aid solution and not anything really substantive. And there is a picture comparing, just so you can kind of see the 2 auditoriums, Moton High School on the right, Farmville High School on the left, just to see. And I intentionally picked a different kind of photo configuration on the Moton side, just so you can kind of start to see the differences.
My replacement.
So this student here is kind of the namesake of some of this program. This is Barbara Rose Johns, but this is also one of the last places we really get to talk about Barbara, because Barbara very much planted seeds in a garden she never truly got to see grow. Barbara was the orchestrator of the strike that was going to happen. She was an 11th grader, a junior at Moton High School, 16 years old. She was involved in some extracurriculars at Moton, but for the most part, she was a fairly quiet student. You know, she wasn't anybody who was the most popular, but I don't think she'd be considered a wallflower by many accounts either. And so Barbara had been frustrated for a long time about the inequality that they faced. And she'd been thinking about doing something. And so, but a catalyst for this event was, an event. And so Barbara lived out in Darlington Heights, Virginia, which is probably 20-30 minutes away from the middle of town where the school is located. So she rode the bus. And so Barbara kind of acted as kind of a de facto third parent. Her parents tended to work away during the week. And so Barbara, being the eldest of the 5 siblings, would kind of make sure that her siblings got up, they got off, out of school, out of the house on the school bus, ready for school. And so one day Barbara's preparing their lunches. She's sending out her younger 4 siblings to the school bus, and she walks out and she realizes she forgets her own lunch. And so Barbara goes back inside, she goes and gets her lunch, she comes back out and the bus is gone. And so she does what any kid would have done at that point in time, and she throws out a thumb and starts hitchhiking. Now, I'll always have to mention today, that's not a very safe thing. Back then, it might not have been the most safe thing either, but back then it would have been a lot more, of course, socially acceptable. And so she waits and nobody comes by. And eventually the half full Farmville High School bus drives by. Now, the catch here is that Farmville High School, they actually would have had to pass by Moton High School on the way to get to Farmville High School. And it was only half full. So Barbara asked them for a ride and they say no, because it would have been illegal for them to pick her up. And so this half full bus continues on. So that was truly a moment for Barbara where she realized, okay, maybe this whole idea of segregation is not what it's cracked up to be. So she had already wanted a new school, right? That was already her thought from the beginning. But I think that incident for her was a moment of maybe an equal school is not just going to solve all of our problems. Okay, so she confided in a music teacher, Miss Inez Davenport. And Miss Inez Davenport she was 26. And so I think in a lot of ways, she ended up being kind of a cooler teacher because she was just younger in age to those students. She's confiding in Miss Davenport and saying how frustrated she is. And Miss Davenport looks at Barbara and says, why don't you go do something about it? Barbara, feeling kind of rejected and kind of put aside, was like, oh, well, all right. Just kind of walked away. But then she started to think about it. And she started to think, why don't I go do something about it? And so she went into her family in her family's woods and kind of Darlington Heights, and she meditated for months and she prayed on it. And eventually she came up with the idea of a strike. Very intentionally, they planned a strike for around April. If you can mess up finals, which April was around, you can mess up graduation. And if you mess up graduation, that would maximize the amount of attention that they got. Barbara then decided to create a committee. So she got some of the more popular students. You're talking kind of student government, student body presidents, presidents of the different clubs, just some of the more people with some social capital. So that way, when she stood up on the stage of Moton High School and said, let's walk out of school, they didn't just all get up and go back to class. Okay, so they were organized and they got successfully, they had planned it, and they decided we're going to do a strike. She's got people on board. April 23rd, 1951 was going to be the day. So during the day of the strike, Barbara sent notes around to all the teachers saying there was going to be an assembly in the auditorium effective immediately. On that note, she signs BJ for Barbara Johns, but the principal's name was Boyd Jones, and he would sign his notes in the exact same way. So very, very, very creative way in order to let the students out to have an assembly in the first place. But then there's the principal, what they do for him. So he was a strong disciplinarian, Principal Jones was. So they prank called the office and said that some students were going to be arrested in the downtown Farmville area unless he came and kind of rescued those students immediately. So Principal Jones kind of frantically leaves the building, and then Barbara, she sends around all those notes, and then they collectively meet in the auditorium for their protest. The curtains open up, students expect to see Principal Jones, and they see Barbara Johns standing there. So Barbara then kind of goes into a speech. She talks about the inequalities they face and how they have to do something about it. This was not something that was universally supported at first. But I think Barbara's persuasiveness and her energy and the fact that it was her convinced enough people to support her that everybody eventually ended up kind of supporting her in kind of a positive peer pressure kind of way. So she kind of goes up on the stage, she gives her speech. Those students walk out with her unanimously. We want a new school strike. Very simple, very to the point. They were on strike, and that strike lasted 2 weeks, 10 school days. Somebody decides, well, we got to sue Prince Edward County. That's the only way they're going to listen. We've been in these negotiations. It's just not progressing. Problem with suing somebody is that you need money and legal representation, of which they had neither. So they reached out to this gentleman, Reverend L. Francis Griffin, who was the pastor of the local First Baptist Church, which was that first Baptist church founded in Prince Edward County. And Reverend Griffin encourages them to reach out to attorneys at the NAACP, Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson. And so they do that. So Barbara Johns and Kerry Stokes write a letter to those attorneys at the NAACP, pleading with them to take their case. Okay. I have to go back to the map from the beginning. So to make a fairly long story kind of short, the NAACP were already interested in Virginia, but not Prince Edward County, to make a case to go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Why? Because in the Virginia Constitution that had been amended in 1902, it said verbatim that white and colored children shall not be taught in the same school, which meant that the NAACP had a path to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, forgive my geography, but if y'all can see my mouse, y'all see Prince Edward, right, in red. The lawyers were in Richmond, so west of here somewhere, right? Or no, that's east. We are an hour west of Richmond. So yes, Richmond somewhere over there. And here's Farmville, right? Or Prince Edward. And they were going to Pulaski, somewhere out here to the west of us, right? So our students knew that in order to get to Pulaski from Richmond, you had to go through Farmville. And so they convinced these lawyers, like, look, these letters are great, but please just stop and hear us out. You know, you're already trying to take a case anyway. Why not listen to us? What can it hurt? And you have to pass through Farmville anyway. We'll give you a place to stay. We'll give you food to eat. So these lawyers heard what the students said and put so little into what the students were saying that by the time they eventually agreed to get to Farmville, and they did, when they got to Farmville, they told the driver to keep the car running because they didn't think that these students were going to be about much. They were greeted in First Baptist Church when they got to Farmville to about 1,000 people, standing room only. And really, that's when this starts to progress immensely, because that's when kind of for the first time, these attorneys go up and speak to the community and say, we're not interested in suing for brick and mortar school buildings. We don't ever believe separate will be equal for African-American people. We think the only way to achieve equality is to be in the same school. So we will take your case under 2 conditions. 1, sue for school desegregation, and 2, all these kids have to get their parents on board because they're all minors. As you can imagine, that was a tremendous issue because it's easy for us now to look back at these black and white photos and to say, well, of course, the students at Moton wanted to go to schools at Farmville High School, right? The Farmville High School was bigger. It might have had more funding. The quality of education might have been different, right? But that's overlooking something very important about being human, and is that we hate changes. We don't like things being different. And probably one of the biggest differences that could have been in these students' lives at that point in time was to go to the same school as the white students. So this was not unanimously, or even I would speculate majority supported by the African-American community here in Prince Edward County. But it was supported by this gentleman here, Reverend L. Francis Griffin, and Barbara Johns. And that 1-2 punch kind of got enough people to support the case and enough of those naysayers to just be quiet for a bit. But this was not something that was unanimously supported within the African-American community. But what does come out of all those meetings and all those discussions was a court case. On May 23rd, 1951, on the month to the day of the strike, they filed paperwork in the Federal District Court in Richmond, Virginia, and became plaintiffs in the Davis v. County School Board of Prince Edward County case. Now, here's a picture of some of those student plaintiffs. This picture was taken in 1952. So that means that a few students certainly had graduated by that point, and that Barbara also is not in this picture. So a lot of people think that this is Barbara, usually just because she's in the front and the middle. That student is actually Dorothy Davis, and that's the first student to sign on to the case and for whom the case is named after. Barbara's story is a bit more sad than that. So remember I mentioned that this is the last place we really get to talk about Barbara. After the strike happens, Barbara received several death threats, and there was actually a cross burning on the school grounds here at Moton High School. And her parents actually move her away for her own safety. So her parents move her away. They keep the other 4 siblings, but they move Barbara away. She goes and lives with her uncle, Vernon Johns, whose name might sound familiar to some of you. So she goes to high school. She graduates her senior year there. She goes to college. She does some time at Spelman College in Atlanta before finishing her education at Drexel University up in Philadelphia, which is where she ends up settling down. Barbara lives in Philadelphia. She gets married. She has 5 beautiful children. She lives a very happy life. She unfortunately passes away in 1991. She was only 56 years old. She had cancer, but luckily her legacy did live on strongly and continues to live on strongly, through the rest of those students you see kind of pictured in there, but also through kind of subsequent court cases and holidays and statutes and things that I am very glad to kind of do some mentioning of in a little bit. So we end up with 117 plaintiffs who were the students, and then once they get their parents kind of on board, ends up being about 181, 182 plaintiffs total who go on to be a part of Brown v. Board of Education. Here is Barbara's little sister, Joan, who's still alive today. If you can see my mouse, I see her there. And since kind of Sheila mentioned in my bio, so my great-grandfather was a plaintiff. Here is my great-aunt Mildred, who's one of his daughters, kind of tucked away behind this gentleman over here. I knew my great-aunt Mildred growing up. She probably passed when I was about 11 or 12 or something like that. My great-grandfather had long passed, but I didn't realize that my great-aunts and my great-grandfather were a part of any of this until I started working here, which was a pretty sobering thing to realize. And I was a little disappointed to not know sooner. All right, here's just a couple of side-by-sides. So the attorneys kind of had decided decided they're taking the case, suing for school desegregation. Here is just a quick snapshot example of how they began to build their case. They knew that it was going to be obvious that separate wasn't equal. That wasn't the point. They had to prove that separate couldn't be equal. Not that it just wasn't here in implementation, but just as a general idea and construct that separate could never actually be equal. But the start of it was proving that it wasn't equal in real time. So property value of Moton High School, $180,000. Property value of Farmville High School, about $440,000. Adjusting for inflation during this time period, multiplied by about 10. All right, so again, no matter how you can compare these situations, separate, yes, equal, no. So the Davis case goes to the court at the state level, and because of that, what I've already mentioned about the state constitution, that white and colored children shall not be taught in the same school, the Davis case loses at the state level, but that was the whole point. They wanted to continue to appeal and appeal and appeal. So they do go to court at the federal level. And the federal district court does agree with these students in the fact that there is a problem, the fact that separate but equal was not being upheld. What the federal court did not agree with was the attorney's solution, which was to desegregate public schools. So the federal court, while agreeing there's a problem, they offered a different solution. And the solution that they forced the county to do, which was to build a new high school. So in 1953, ignore this here, because that'll come into play later, but they built this high school in 1953, this brand new $800,000 high school. The problem in this case was that if this high school that was offered by Prince Edward County to these Black students, if they accepted that school, they would have had to drop the lawsuit, because the whole premise of this case was that separate wasn't equal. And if they had accepted that school, they would have had a better school than what the white students had. So there was no way in which they could accept that and go forward in court. And so they decline it. That building goes largely unused for about a year. The Black students would take that building after the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, but it would still be segregated at that point. So the Davis case actually kind of stalls out in the federal court level after that. And Oliver Hill, who's continuing with the Davis case, actually was good friends with a gentleman whose name I guarantee you all know, Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall offers Oliver the chance to bring in the Davis case to these other 4 cases that he was already arguing out of South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Wilmington, Delaware, and of course, Topeka, Kansas. Now, 182 plaintiffs from Brown v. Board of Education were right here in Prince Edward County. That's about 75% of all the plaintiffs in Brown versus Board of Education. This is also the only case out of these 5 that was led by students. Okay, now why am I bringing this up? Not to imply that Prince Edward, the Davis case was better or worse than any of the other cases, but to say there's some things that make it stand out. So why does it take the name of Brown? So I always have to say that firstly, most people just don't know that there were 5 cases that made Brown versus Board of Education. There were, just so you know, if you didn't know, now you know, kind of deal, right? A lot of people don't know. For folks who do know, often I find that they'll say, oh, well, they were put in alphabetical order. And that's why Brown comes first. 3 problems with that. Briggs, Bowling, Belton come before Brown alphabetically. It's a lot more deliberate than that. So think geography when you think of these 5 places. South Carolina, south. DC, close to the south. Virginia, south. Wilmington, Delaware, border state. right? Topeka, Kansas is in the Midwest. One of these things is not like the other. People were talking about segregation plenty in the South. They were not talking about segregation necessarily in the Midwest. Doesn't mean it wasn't happening. So by picking Topeka, Kansas, these attorneys want to show that segregation is a problem that impacts the whole country and not just something that impacts the South, because they knew what the language would be coming out of this conversation in this case. It still was, but incredible foresight on the part of these attorneys to try to do everything in their power to limit kind of the impacts of some of that rhetoric that will be going against what they said. And of course, as you all know, May 17th, 1954, unanimous Supreme Court decision, they conclude in the field of public education that the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. That is great. That is important. That is crucial. That is not the end of our story, though, unfortunately, as I begin to pick it up here to make sure I get y'all out on time, at least some questions for Q&A. So the Brown v. Board of Education decision, it gave us the who is impacted. It gave us the what needs to happen, the why it needs to happen, and where it's going to happen. Important, right? What the Brown decision did not give us is the how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen. So Brown 1 gave us those 4 things, but it took another case 1 year later, the Brown 2 decision, to give us the how and the when this is going to happen. The how is that the U.S. Supreme Court gives the power to the federal district courts to go out and enforce this case. The when is 4 words: with all deliberate speed. Problem is, what in the world does that mean? 2 years, 2 months, 20 years, 2 weeks, 20 days? I don't know, right? It's very ambiguous, which meant that a lot of states like Virginia could work around it and try to not listen and to not adhere to the Brown v. Board of Education decision. So massive resistance, I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about this. I'm going to probably skip over massive resistance a bit and get to the school closures, but just at least we'll point him out very quickly. Harry Flood Byrd, 50th governor of Virginia, was a U.S. senator out of Virginia for 32 years. Created the term massive resistance, orchestrated something called the Byrd Machine. Essentially was known as kind of the father of massive resistance. Massive resistance is all these laws, policies, every kind of mechanism of Virginia government and state government generally to avoid listening to the U.S. Supreme Court decision of Brown versus Board of Education. So the state were willing to do everything in their power, including close down its own schools in some places. So 65 years ago, this marks the 65th anniversary of Warren County, Charlottesville, and Norfolk, all having various schools closed. And almost Arlington as well. Arlington did not end up having their schools closed for a very, very particular reason. So the judge in the Arlington case, who had initially ordered that desegregation order, actually ordered a stay on his own decision, basically to prevent the schools in Arlington from becoming closed. So a judge made a ruling and then made a second ruling to overturn his first ruling, essentially to basically stop those schools from going into effect, which is just very, very weird. And I've really never heard of that happening anywhere else, but it speaks to the uniqueness of the situation. In Norfolk, there's a group called the Norfolk 17 African-American students trying to desegregate a group of about 10,000 white high school students. And 65 years ago, the state shut down every single one of those white high schools. Now, I said that very intentionally because the colored schools in those areas do stay open. But in the case of Norfolk, the 17 chose to stay out of school in solidarity with their white peers who were also out of school. This did not last terribly long in the grand scheme of things. You're looking 8-10 months, because by February 2nd, 1959, you do have the first desegregated schools in Virginia, in Norfolk and in Arlington. But that's 5 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Here in Prince Edward County, we've been watching all that unfold very carefully. And what we had realized is that the state cannot go against the federal government in this context. But what hadn't been tested is could a local government go against the federal government? And so on June 2nd, 1959, after watching the state fail, Prince Edward County votes to defund public education, not partially, but in its entirety. So the state had closed down some schools, and there were only white schools that closed. Prince Edward County vote to defund public education in its entirety. So 1959, 22 schools closed, Black and white. Most schools would never reopen, but the public school would eventually reopen in the fall of 1964. So 10 months was the second longest amount of time, and then 5 years was how long schools were closed in Prince Edward County. So I say that to say, even for the time period in which this happened, that was pretty unprecedented. So they do open up a private school. The very long story short is that the state had tuition grants that were designed to send students, white students, away from desegregating public schools. Okay, the purpose of that fund has the tuition grants that was designed to send white students away. to go to private schools to get away from desegregating public schools. That money was used to send some white students to the academy for the first 2 years. After the first 2 years, the white students in Prince Edward become ineligible, because note how I said that sentence. There was state tuition grants that were meant to send white students away to private schools to get away from desegregating public schools. The catch was here in Prince Edward County is that there was no public school, so they couldn't use those funds. So African Americans couldn't go to the school, of course, because that would defy the point. But then poor, not just poor, but also working class or just white families with a lot of kids couldn't afford to go to the academy. What did the rest of the kids do? Plenty of kids got sent away. I'm not going to go to that slide yet. Plenty of kids got sent away. There were programs that were started here locally, but just know it was a tumultuous time. It was really, really, really awful. And families had to make a lot of awful decisions if they were going to continue to get their children an education. So my father was mentioned earlier, so I'll tell you a little bit about him. So my dad was 6 when the schools closed. And also have to mention he was going to start the 1st grade, but this is before kindergarten. So going to school for the first time in the 1st grade. He does not, because the schools don't open. And so he works on his family farm, primarily picking tobacco in Meharron, Virginia, which is like 30 minutes outside of the town. By the time he goes back to school, he turns 11 years old, but was in the 1st grade. I do consider my dad to be one of the luckier ones, because he does go through school. He does graduate high school around 22 years old, older than I was when I graduated from college, right? But I do consider him lucky because he finished, even though he finished older than his high school senior English teacher. Plenty of folks never just got the chance to finish. Imagining being kind of 14, 15 when schools closed, being 18, 19 when schools reopened, plenty of folks never went back. Plenty of folks just never started or were working full time or had kids by the time schools reopened. So unfortunately and sadly, because of those facts, it means we have today an adult literacy rate and double-digit kind of adult illiteracy rate. And the higher you go up in age, the lower the literacy rate tends to go in this county, which is quite awful. An area, we have 2 colleges here, we've got a pretty good hospital and some other things that are going for us, which in other areas would mean that the kind of adult population would be more educated and that our schools would be a little bit better. But unfortunately, some aspects of the history, still having those consequences today. But kind of to get us to the Q&A, because I know we're getting close to that and I don't want to go over my time. No part of the story that I'm sharing were these communities kind of passive players in this. Everything that happened, these communities fought back. And that's going to be the main thing I really want you to take away from this story, but also from Juneteenth in general, right? When you had enslavement, you had abolition. When you had segregation, you had desegregation efforts. They didn't have a school here, they fought, they got a school. Schools are segregated, they fought, they got them desegregated, right? Nothing happens here by accident. And that's an important thing to talk about when we talk about agency in these African-American communities as well. So these students were not dumb, even though they had been out of school. They still had radios, they still kind of read the newspaper when they could, and they were aware of current events. So this picture is one of the protest signs 60 years ago in the summer of 1963. Kids had been out for 4 years. You had saw mass demonstrations throughout the country, and somebody looks up and say, hey, we've got something to protest for here. Why are we not striking in Prince Edward? So they go and protest, not only the fact that the school's been closed for that time, 4 years going on 5, but also the segregation of downtown businesses in Farmville. Note some of those signs, right? Money talks, don't buy, and they'll hear all cry, freedom. So they're not just pushing for kind of educational advancement, they want economic advancement as well, which as you kind of see at this point in the movement, those 2 kind of things become interchangeable in a lot of ways. This probably our most iconic photo from this protest in 1963. I've lost 4 years of education, why 5? Let's tell Russia about this. Why Russia, right? Cold War, space race. We're at a time where the United States is spreading democracy throughout the world and denying democracy to these citizens based on the color of their skin. Again, these kids have been out of school, but they weren't stupid. They were aware of what was happening, and they get the attention of the Kennedy administration. And we even get a visit from Bobby Kennedy in 1964, and President John F. Kennedy was also supposed to visit in 1964, but obviously was not able to. So Bobby Kennedy was kind of the one who was put in charge of the situation. So JFK put in charge RFK. RFK put his number 2 guy, who was a man by the name of William Vanden Heuvel. And then William Vanden Heuvel kind of deputized a guy by the name of Neil Sullivan to really kind of fix the issue. So the thing was, the federal government couldn't be involved in the court case. The federal government could not force a local government to appropriate funds for a specific purpose. But the Kennedys knew that this problem was going to continue unless they did something. And so they kind of leaned into some of their private donors They raised about $1 million or so in a year's time, and they used that money to open up what they would call the Prince Edward Free School. And that's kind of what JFK put RFK, who put Sullivan, who put Vanden Heuvel, who put Sullivan in charge of doing. So Sullivan was the guy who was running that free school, which is what I was just describing. So they've been called the free school because they're free in price, and they'd be free for any person of any race in the county to attend. The thing was, the Kennedys knew, and so did the people in Prince Edward to a maybe slightly lesser extent, that eventually public schools would probably have to reopen. The problem would be then is that you got 2,000 plus kids, many of which who had never been to school, who'd be sending back to a public school setting for the first time. And so the free schools kind of acted as a way to kind of get some of these students caught up and to prepare them to go back to a traditional public school setting. So through that involvement, after the protests, after the Kennedy involvement, after the free schools do open up. They were overwhelmingly successful, but only open for a year because they only had to be open for a year. At the end of the free school year was another U.S. Supreme Court case, the Griffin decision. And the Griffin decision, named after Reverend L. Francis Griffin, does force Prince Edward County to reopen its schools in the fall of 1964, thereby kind of ending that 13-year history that we talk about at the museum. Now, today, so the museum has been open since 2001. This building does operate as a school until about 1993. When the county's middle school was done, they surplus the building. Some concerned citizens raised money to purchase the building, and we opened up in 2001 as the Moton Museum. We have since then, in 2013, 10 years ago, done some renovations. So we reverse renovated the auditorium to make it look like what it would have in the 40s and 50s. And we installed this building, which is a replica of one of those tar paper shack buildings around 2015. But inside the building, we also renovated where the old classrooms and such were, which is now our permanent exhibition here at the museum. Okay. Then at least it's about 10 minutes if folks have any questions. I've not really been monitoring the chat, but if there are some, I'm glad to answer any questions. And if there ends up being like an extra 5 minutes or so, there's other stuff I can fill time with.
That was fascinating, Cainan. I really appreciate it. Really wonderful. Do we have any questions from the audience? The thing in the chat is a comment, just that one person's been to the museum and it was very interesting.
Nice. That's good. I'm glad to hear that. Come on back and see us again sometime.
I think I'm just struck that Prince Edward County went to the extreme step of closing their schools and just basically cutting off their nose to spite their face and prevent students from getting their education. It sounds more like China with closing the schools and with their re-education programs than something that would happen in the United States.
Could I share? Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, you're good. I'll say it after. Good.
I just wanted to share a comment. I don't have a question, but I'm retired now, but I taught self-contained and co-taught government. So I learned what I could about Barbara Johns. And of course, I taught about what we all call the Brown decision. But I have to say my knowledge was so surface and I just got so much out of this. So I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for that comment.
Somebody else is saying you're very good and great product of Prince Edward County Schools. Should be proud.
I'd like to make a statement that right after the decision to desegregate, I went to Howard as a Northerner, and I found that the students that were from the South, or at least from Richmond and that area, were so much smarter than the kids in the North because their education meant so much to them that they were learning. I don't know how the white students were at the white schools, but I know that the African American students were really into learning what needed to be learned. But I also think that they also learned about Black history. I'm not sure. Is that not the case?
No, they absolutely did. And if you a great book I'd recommend, Fugitive Pedagogy. You kind of hear some of that story, kind of to juxtapose to the kind of today's kind of the way that kind of public education landscape is now, essentially talking about how African American teachers were back in the day. You know, you'd have superintendents and such who might would pop into your classroom, and it's kind of like literally and metaphorically a book inside of a book, right? You'd have a book teaching about kind of let's say Carter G. Woodson, right? Kind of in the middle, and then on the outside of it, you'd have like whatever that leftover hand-me-down book that's 100 years old that the county might have given you. Basically, say that we've been these teachers for years have been used to kind of hiding vegetables inside of meals that might not otherwise have vegetables in them. I guess if that makes sense, but absolutely correct.
We have a hand raised, Judith.
Yes, I got to the program a little late, so if you already covered this, I apologize. But did you mention that, Virginia replaced in Statuary Hall, one of our 2 statues is now to Barbara Johns, replacing Robert E. Lee.
So I haven't named any accolades, but I'm glad to do that now, saving that for the end. But you're right on the money. So in terms of why is it important, why is it significant? What are some ways it's been acknowledged? So in 2004, I want to say they started the Farmville Board of Education Scholarship, which was created in Virginia to send anybody who was impacted by school closures in Norfolk. They included Arlington as well, Norfolk, Arlington, Warren County, Charlottesville, and of course, Prince Edward, to go to college for free. So that was really, really huge. I know some folks who have gotten bachelor's, master's, and doctorate with those funds. And this year, actually, with the Brown Scholarship, they decided to open it up to descendants of those who were also locked out of school, because there's still money left, and that population is just aging very, very quickly, naturally so. And so they are going to open up that money in the 2024-25 year to their descendants. In 2008, right on Capitol Square, right by the governor's mansion, Civil Rights Monument in Virginia went up, featuring Barbara Johns, Oliver Hill, Reverend Griffin, other NAACP attorneys, some of the other Milton students and such, which is really, really huge. And other significance behind that monument in particular is that if you look on Monument Ave, right, you see all the pedestals and all the giant statues that used to be up on all these monuments, but the Barbara John statue is very, very intentionally designed to be on person level. Now, why is that, right? You can see that as a bit of a disrespectful thing. Well, it was meant to be more of so students can see themselves standing alongside Barbara Johns. And so at any given time, you will see students out taking selfies with the statue and such, because they can just go up because she's approachable, unlike some of the other statues, which I think is a really, really important note. In 2017, they renamed the Virginia Attorney General building after Barbara Johns. In 2018, we got a state holiday, Barbara Johns Day, in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Of course, what was just mentioned, hopefully later this year, Barbara Johns' statue will join George Washington's in Statuary Hall in Washington, D.C. Robert E. Lee statue was taken down many months ago, is my impression. So it's just remaining empty until Barbara Johns will be standing alongside George Washington as our Virginia state representatives in Washington, D.C. And of course, which will be the last thing I mentioned for right now, with the museum being on the U.S. Civil Rights Trail, we are currently in the throes of going through World Heritage status nominations. So we submitted a serial nomination for World Heritage. So it's us and about 8 other sites that are on the U.S. Civil Rights Trail. So you're talking like Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, First Baptist Church in Montgomery, Medgar Evers Home in Mississippi, sites like that we've grouped together, and we've submitted a World Heritage nomination. So if this was to go through, this would put Moton in a similar talking category as the pyramids, the Great Barrier Reef, and the Great Wall of China, right? Mm-hmm. So that would be a huge, huge historical designation if we were to get that. And of course, we're working very, very much towards that as well. But there has been some great acknowledgments lately. So I appreciate you bringing that one up. And we just hope to be invited to as much of it as possible.
Fantastic, fantastic. We do have a question in the chat asking if you could remind us, please, of the name of the book you recommended, Fugitive Pedagogy. Is that? Yes,
that would be the one. If you were curious in that specifically, Fugitive Pedagogy would be a great, yeah, that'd be a great one to read.
Okay, and then somebody else organized a tour to the museum and liked it very much. Maybe our 55 plus travel program could come. Do you do group tours?
We do.
Yeah, maybe
glad to host. And what I will say, there's no real experience like being on site here at Moton. There's a really big kind of power in being in the place where this stuff happens. And even sometimes me, like, and I'm here every day, I've been working here, it'll be 7 years, me working here in August. And even some days more than others, but some days I walk through and it feels, you can just feel it, you feel the energy, and the fact that some important stuff happened there. So I encourage everybody to come in person if you're able to, because it is free. I mean, that's the big thing. We work hard to make sure we keep it free, and almost all of our programming is free to the public, and we try to keep it that way. So come and see us.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? So educational. Thank you. You've been very much appreciated by our audience. Anybody else have a question? Okay,
I just wanted to say thank you. That was very interesting. Thank you.
You're welcome. You're all very welcome. And so let me say, I'll just say this has been great. I've appreciated this. This is I will say this is the SparkNote version. So if you want the full version, there's a ton of resources I'm willing to share with you all. Any of that stuff you can find on motonmuseum.org, or just call us and set up a tour, or virtual programming, all of which is for the most part free. So thank you all for your time, and look forward to hopefully seeing you all in Farmville sometime.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much. This was wonderful. Really learned a lot, and you presented it beautifully, and really honored that you would take the time to speak with us and enrich our lives with sharing this history that a lot of us need a little refresher on. So we appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it. Hope to see you again soon. Take care, everyone. Be well.